Hey there, it's Professor Sen-Foong Lim here, and I'm speaking at PetchKitchCon 2021. I'm talking about game design from a psychological perspective because when I'm not designing games, I'm a psych prof. And today I'm going to talk to you about applying the theories of Vygotsky, Csikszentmihalyi, and Skinner to your game design. Okay? So, Vygotsky was famous for the social cultural theory of learning, in which he stated that children learn about their world through interacting with it and the people in it. So, learning from his point of view is essentially a social process, and people and culture play crucial roles in how children interact with their environment and learn from it. The zone of proximal development was Lev Vygotsky's claim to fame. He thought that people can do stuff on their own, and then there's this very gray area, and that is what people can do with help. And there's also the area that they can't do anything about because they don't have the skills yet. And the gray area is what's called the zone of proximal development, and that's where people need help, like technology or instructors or rules. And so we use things called scaffolding in the zone of proximal development to support the learner while they're building up their knowledge. Eventually, we can remove that scaffolding, but the learning remains intact. And we do this all the time in games through rules, through walkthroughs, through all sorts of things. Speech becomes thought in humans. According to Vygotsky, he thought that speech without thought happened when we're infants, and that speech with thought happened when we were adults. And sometime in the middle, we had thought with speech. And this is really important because this is how games are taught. We also internalize speech. We start with external social speech, talking to each other. Then we internalize that and end up with private speech where we're just talking to ourselves. We internalize that even further and it becomes inner speech. And inner speech is what Vygotsky called thought. Now, we see this all the time in what we do. For when Rodney does a watch it played, he talks verbally through all the steps he's doing, which is teaching you how to play the game. When we write player aids that have the turn sequence on it. We are doing that when we provide an in rules walkthrough about how the game is played, like this excellent one in Crossmasters. We are doing this scaffolding. We also design levels, and that is scaffolding as well. For example, in Kingdom Rush, level 1 versus level 2, you can see that we took a whole ton of stuff out of level 2 because we've already built it in the front end. The only thing that changes is when we add new rules. The next thing we're going to talk about briefly is the flow. And this is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory. And I use this in therapy all the time in terms of people are in flow state when they are not keeping track of the time. Time passes without them even knowing it's happening. Now, Csikszentmihalyi had this idea that as our abilities meet up with the challenge in terms of level of difficulty, we attain a state of flow. But if our skill is too low and the difficulty is too high, we might be in a state of discontent. So let's talk about what that looks like. For example, if we are anxious, we might be studying or working. If we're worried, we might be having hassles in our life. If we're apathetic, we might just be bored and watching television. If we're aroused, we might be learning. Boredom comes when we're doing chores. We might be relaxed when we're eating, in control when we're driving, and when we're doing a favorite activity like playing games, we should be in flow. And I use flow a lot when I'm observing how people play the game when we're playtesting. I don't want them bored. I don't want them anxious. I want them engaged. So either aroused, in control, or in flow. I want to see that level of engagement there. And if it's not there, something's broken. And what's usually broken is that they are not in the flow channel. Either they are bored because they have too much skill for the level of difficulty that's presented to them in the game, or the game is too difficult for the level of skill that they have and they disengage because they're frustrated. I want to keep them in the flow. So I need to really balance the skill and difficulty levels. And this balance and scaling can be a design challenge. So, for example, should your party of level 1 fighters and magic users and thieves fight a bunch of goblins in Dungeons and Dragons or an ancient red dragon? Well, they actually have challenge ratings. Goblins are a quarter challenge rating, whereas an ancient red dragon is at a challenge rating of 24. The last thing we're going to talk about flow is going with the flow or desired path. Sometimes people will choose to behave in the way that feels most natural to them, and we should watch that, observe that, and maybe go with it. So if your players discard all their cards at the end of the turn instead of the beginning, maybe you should do that. Follow them. The last theorist we're going to talk about is B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, there are three main things you need to know: the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. The antecedent really is the cue that tells somebody to perform a behavior, whereas the consequence happens after the behavior and drives the person to do it again and again. It's a reward usually. Now, when we put it all together, antecedents can be prompts, models, feedback, goals. Behaviors can be desired or undesirable. And the consequences that we use are what's called reinforcement or punishment. Negative and positive are a little tricky to describe in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, but we'll get to that. So, examples of antecedents. Well, we might use prompts where we're using phase structure and score track to tell people when to act and how to act. We might use models when we're playing. So, we might emulate an expert player. We might read examples and strategy tips in the rules. We might get feedback from other players telling us, to go on and do things. We might get goals like building a higher tower in junk card or finishing a rote card. In consequences, we might, have positive reinforcement where we're gaining coins on cards that weren't chosen in Small World, negative reinforcements like scrapping explorers in Star Realms, positive punishment like activating the buzzer in Operation, and negative punishment like subtracting points for incomplete route cards in Ticket to Ride. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to create play loops by using cues and incentives. If we have clear incentives, that leads to desired behavior, we're going to get positive or negative reinforcement. An example from Star Realms might be the objective defend, where we need to have two or more outposts in play. We might buy the outpost as a behavior, and our reward is to draw two cards, and we're closer to our win. That's all I have time for. Thank you very much. We'll see you later.